and the situation crisis facing Albertans. This is a serious issue to Albertans, and they are starting to despair. And there are 29 Conservative members of Parliament in this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, and all of them would have loved to have the opportunity to speak to this important issue tonight. But we only had 6 slots, and I was privileged enough to be granted one of them. Now, for those of you who may not know, I'm not an Alberta Member of Parliament. I come from Ontario, from Aurora Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill, which is just north of Toronto. And I probably, like many other Canadians, didn't fully understand and appreciate the extent, the seriousness, the severity, and the contribution of the oil and gas industry, not only in Alberta, but to Canada as a whole. And then I had the opportunity to go to Calgary. And the Member of Parliament from Calgary-Nose Hill, the Member of Parliament from Lakeland, the Member of Parliament from Foothills, and many of the other Alberta Members of Parliament took the time to explain to me just how significant and serious this is. So I want to thank the Conservative Members of Parliament, and I want to thank their constituents for giving me the opportunity to communicate to them a very important message that I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that those in Canada like me who don't understand how important Alberta is to Canada understand, and I hope that I also can communicate the important message to Albertans that we understand how much you matter to Canada. Because if Alberta is in crisis, Mr. Speaker, Canada is in crisis, and it's time for us to unite and to build a nation, because this is one country, one Canada. So the times are tough, and Alberta is in a crisis. And yet, in the economic update, we heard from the finance minister that the economy is growing, everything is rosy, we have nothing to be concerned about, and this Liberal government can take full credit for everything that is great, and there's nothing to be concerned about, and certainly no problems that need addressing or to be fixed. Now, don't be fooled, because we can agree to disagree, but even if we look at the statistics that he's providing us, they are lag indicators. He's looking at data in the past. He's not actually looking at where we are today, and therefore looking at what that means for the future. And so we look to Alberta as being the initial indicator. It is the beginning of what will then happen to the rest of the country. Alberta has lost over 100,000 jobs, and they've lost over $100 billion in investment. So why does the oil and gas industry matter? Well, for many years, it has been the economic engine and has driven much of the growth that this country has enjoyed. It has the 3rd largest oil reserves, it's the 4th largest oil exporter, and it is Canada's 2nd largest export. It's the #1 contributor to private investor in the Canadian economy, and it contributes over 11% to the overall Canadian economy. That is nothing to sneeze at. That is significant. And that incredible economic engine is now stalled, Mr. Speaker. And why is that? Well, because corporations made decisions. No, Mr. Speaker, it's not about corporations making informed economic decisions that were out of the control or the purview of this government. It's because of policy and regulatory decisions that this government has chosen to make, and in some instances has chosen not to make. The regulatory burdens that have been placed on the approval process to get pipelines built are incredibly complicated, are not clear, and the goalposts keep changing. They're overwhelmingly complex and therefore are driving those corporations outside of this country because, like other industries, we, Canada, are competing with other jurisdictions to bring that business to Canada. And if our regulatory and policy environment is so difficult to understand, they're going to choose other jurisdictions where they can get those things built. And so what does that mean? It means that we cannot get our incredible oil and gas to markets. We can't build pipelines to Tidewater. What does that mean? It means to the oceans to be able to get it to foreign lands abroad, and it means we can't get them south. So we can't get them to market, and unfortunately, it's the longer you wait, the more that those other suppliers in the world for oil and gas that we're competing with, they fill the void. And so you'll lose that window and you'll never get it back. You're also losing massive amounts of capital investment that, of course, we need not only for today, but for the growth and the continued economic engine into the future. And we're also talking about energy security, because we need to have our country be able to look after itself. We have enough energy reserves. So we need to have that energy independence because it gives us energy security as well as economic security, and to a certain extent now in these uncertain times in the world, it gives us defense security. So that talks about why the oil and gas industry matters in Alberta, but why does it also matter to Canada? Well, because we're not only losing the revenue to the oil and gas industry, but we also have one job in oil creates 7 manufacturing jobs. And we have all kinds of business, financial markets in the stock market and in our financial markets that come from oil and gas, and $3.9 billion in Ontario alone was provided from oil and gas purchases for supplies. And 12% of jobs in the oil and gas industry can be created in Ontario. And that will generate $153 billion that will contribute to the oil and gas in the Ontario economy from 2017 to 2027, if we can get some of these pipelines built, and that would contribute $12.6 billion in taxes to Ontario, which would go a long way for all kinds of services in Ontario that are highly needed. So by not being able to leverage that potential, not only is Alberta suffering, Ontario suffering, and other parts of the country that also benefit. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was in Calgary last week, and he talked to Albertas and said that he feels their pain. He also said that this is a complicated matter and there is no simple or easy answer. And yet, Mr. Speaker, to simply say that you feel their pain is really not enough, because ultimately he is the Prime Minister. And job of being Prime Minister is probably to solve the complicated and difficult challenges facing the nation. And so we are looking to that Prime Minister to do what needs to be done. He needs to lead the country, and he needs to solve difficult problems, and he needs to make sure these things get done. So, in closing, I'd also like to make sure that we speak to Albertans. Don't despair, because there are many of us in this House of Commons who are understanding just what a crisis this is. We are uniting with you, and we are not going to stop until we are able to build the nation that we need to be in these pipelines, because we're looking at one country, one Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. We'll try to get 3 questions in. The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her speech, because just like her, I'm a Quebecer. I come from a different region, but I do also care very much about the people of Alberta. And I listened very carefully to a lot of the speeches tonight, and I'm a little perturbed that so much of it is focused on blaming one side or the other for things that happen instead of actually looking at solutions. But I've heard a couple of solutions from my Conservative colleagues. They talked about how horrible Bill C-48 was and how horrible Bill C-69 was, yet the honourable member voted in favour of both C-48 and C-69 at all stages. So how does she reconcile the opinion she's expressed tonight with her current verbiage?
Honourable member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, what my honourable colleague is referring to is when I was actually a member of Parliament as a Liberal. And I didn't fully appreciate just how devastating C-48 and C-69 were, not only to Alberta, but to the entire country. And so I'm very grateful to the colleagues on this side of the House who have given me the opportunity to understand the complexity and why those were bad bills. So I have no problem reconciling it because I didn't know what I knew then, and I am doing my very best to know what I know now and make amends.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan and West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. And she did seem to lay a lot of the blame for none of these pipelines getting built on the doorstep of, environmental impact processes that are too, regulations that are too difficult for these pipelines to pass. And I know she has a unique view here in the House from both sides, and perhaps she could tell me, does she not realize that these difficult processes that these pipelines are going through are the rather weak processes that the Conservatives dreamed up in the previous Parliament? Bill C-69, and we have different views on this, it has not come to pass yet. It's still in the Senate, and I don't think it would change things much despite what we hear from the Conservatives. But what these pipelines have gone through in terms of assessment process is the flawed process.
The honourable member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. But essentially what they've done is two things. They've frozen the existing processes to ensure that nothing happens, and they have created an incredible breadth of uncertainty around what the processes are going to be in the future. So you can't expect industry to, A, wait around to see what it's going to be in the future, and B, to spend that time and money knowing that certain processes have been frozen in place. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Battle River, Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Monday night we debated in an emergency debate about 2,500 people laid off in Oshawa, and I appreciated her speech then, and I appreciate it again tonight. Thank you for bringing that speech tonight. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-69, there is nothing that will shut down investment in Alberta and investment in Canada like C-69. According to a whole list of gas and oil people, C-69 will shut it down. It will shut down investment in jobs, money leaving our province and our country. Oh, so one report said $100 billion. What I have is $85 billion. And Mr. Speaker, we are seeing jobs leave 100,000 in Alberta, and a carbon tax coming in, purchase of a pipeline that tells those who would invest in the sector, saying they say, well, why would we invest? The government's just going to take over, or the government's going to make it impossible for us to take the oil to Tidewater. They banned shipping traffic on the West Coast. Maybe she would like just to fill us in a little bit more about the policy that she talked about that is hindering job creation in this country.
Member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
I think it would be unfair of me, Mr. Speaker, to even try to compete with that excellent broad spectrum list of all the things that are exactly. And I think the punchline really is that anyone wanting to invest here is having a really difficult time understanding exactly where the goalposts are, what they're going to have to demonstrate, what they're going to be held to, and what kind of timeline they can expect. So it doesn't matter what we're talking about, the complexity, the uncertainty, no one knows when they come to invest in Canada what they can expect, and that is driving them to other jurisdictions where the information is clearer and they know that they can get stuff done. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with the member from Kingston and the Islands. It's a great honor and privilege to be speaking tonight to this emergency debate and crisis that has emerged in the oil and gas sector and the Canadian energy